Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The Billionaire Next Door. The rain had been a constant companion in Juniper Creek all day, a soft, insistent whisper against the windows of the rusty anchor, Tess's bar. It was the kind of rain that encouraged introspection, the kind that made the world outside a blurry watercolour and the world inside with its warm amber glow feel like a sanctuary. Tess, perched on a stool behind the gleaming mahogany bar, wiped down a newly polished glass with a practiced, almost meditative rhythm. She liked the quiet hum of these early evenings, the scent of aged wood and faint hops, the promise of stories yet to unfold. She was a cynic by nature, hardened by a string of unreliable men and the relentless grind of keeping a small business afloat in a town that sometimes felt as sleepy as its name suggested. Yet, a part of her, a deep, stubbornly hopeful part, always listened for the jingle of the bell above the door, waiting for something different. It was almost 7 p.m. when the bell chimed, and in walked Different. He wasn't the usual grizzled local or the weekend tourist looking for a novelty. He was tall, with a lean build that suggested more subtle strength than brute force, and his clothes, while casual, a dark, well-cut sweater, pristine jeans, had a quiet elegance that whispered of bespoke tailors, not department store racks. He looked a little lost, like a city slicker who'd taken a wrong turn into a fairy tale. His eyes, though, were what truly caught Tess's attention, a startlingly clear shade of blue, framed by long, dark lashes, and carrying a certain awkward shyness that was utterly disarming. He approached the bar, hesitating for a moment before settling onto a stool. "Evening," he said, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle. "What do you recommend?" "Something local, I suppose." Tess couldn't help but crack a small smile. "Depends on what you're looking for, city boy," she teased, her voice a warm alto laced with just the right amount of sass. "We've got our own microbrew, juniper juice, or if you're feeling adventurous, something called Bear's Breath IPA. He chuckled, a soft, genuine sound. "Juniper juice sounds safer. I'm Alex, by the way. Just moved into that old place on Willow Lane." Tess's eyebrows arched. The house on Willow Lane was a rambling, beautiful Victorian that had sat empty for years, rumoured to be haunted by a benevolent ghost and in desperate need of a facelift. "Well, Alex, welcome to Juniper Creek. I'm Tess." She poured him a glass of the amber ale, the liquid catching the light. "So, what brings a city boy like you to our little slice of nowhere?" She watched him closely as she asked, a familiar spark of curiosity stirring beneath her guarded exterior. He took a slow sip of his beer, his gaze drifting to the rain-streaked window. "Just needed a change of pace," he finally said, his voice a little softer now, a faint tension tightening his jaw. "Get away from a lot of noise. The city can be overwhelming." There was a slight pause before he continued, almost as if he were carefully selecting his words. "Needed a quiet corner, a place where things move a bit slower." Tess's inner cynic, a well-honed instinct, pinged. He was vague, too vague. He spoke of noise and overwhelming like a man who'd seen too much of something, not just a bustling metropolis. There was a flicker of something unsettled in his clear blue eyes, a fleeting shadow that suggested depths he wasn't ready to reveal. "He's got eyes that could drown you, but something's definitely off," she thought, a familiar caution settling over her. Still, there was an honesty in his awkwardness, a disarming simplicity that chipped away at her usual defences. He wasn't trying too hard, wasn't putting on airs, just existing, a quiet presence in her normally predictable world. As the evening wore on, the The bar slowly filled with the usual Friday night crowd. Tess moved with practiced efficiency, pouring drinks, exchanging banter, her eyes occasionally flicking to Alex. He stayed at the bar, nursing his single beer, seemingly content to just observe. He wasn't loud or demanding, he simply was. He watched her too, she noticed, a thoughtful intensity in his gaze that made her skin prickle with a strange awareness. It wasn't predatory, not even overtly flirtatious, but something deeper, as if he were trying to read the unwritten chapters of her life. Around midnight, as the last few regulars began to trickle out, the rain picked up its pace, drumming a frantic rhythm against the roof. Tess started her nightly routine, the rhythmic clinking of glasses as she washed them filling the near-empty space. Alex remained on his stool, seemingly oblivious to the late hour. "You know," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the refrigerator, "you run a good place here. There's a realness to it. A soul." Tess paused, a clean glass suspended in her hand. Compliments usually slid off her like water off a duck's back, but his felt different, more like an observation than flattery. "Thanks," she said, genuinely touched. "It's a lot of work, but it's mine." He nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I can see that. You built this, didn't you? From the ground up?" "Pretty much," she admitted, a rare flicker of pride showing. "Took every penny I had, and then some." She started stacking chairs on tables, the familiar creak of wood against wood filling the silence. Without a word, Alex slid off his stool and began to help, his movement surprisingly graceful for someone so seemingly out of place. He stacked chairs with ease, carried empty kegs to the back, and even helped wipe down tables. It was an unexpected gesture, and Tess found herself watching him, a warmth spreading through her chest. As they worked side by side, reaching for the same cleaning rag, their hands brushed. It was a fleeting touch, yet it sparked an electric current that shot straight up Tess's arm, leaving a lingering warmth. His blue eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, before they both quickly looked away, a blush rising on Tess's cheeks. The smell of damp earth from outside, carried on the rain-cooled air, filled the bar, mingling with the faint scent of cleaning solution, and something else. Something clean and subtly masculine that was uniquely Alex. When they were finally done, the bar was pristine, ready for another day. The only light now came from the soft glow of the neon sign in the front window, casting long, shifting shadows across the floor. "Thanks, Alex," Tess said, a little breathy, her voice softer than she intended. "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "It was nice, different from my usual evenings." He hesitated then. "Will you be here tomorrow night?" Tess's heart gave an unexpected flutter. "Always am. Friday nights are my busiest." "Good," he said, and the single word was enough. He nodded, a silent farewell, and then, with a final lingering look that held a question she couldn't quite decipher, he disappeared into the drumming rain, leaving Tess alone in the quiet bar, the lingering warmth of his touch still on her skin, and the unsettling feeling that she had just met someone who would change everything. The rain continued its steady rhythm, a gentle accompaniment to the rapid beat of her own heart, a heart that, despite her cynicism, had just been nudged awake. The sun, a rare and welcome guest after days of rain, painted the world outside Juniper Creek in hues of emerald and gold. Tess, despite her usual aversion to early mornings, found herself waking with an unfamiliar lightness in her chest. The memory of Alex, of his quiet intensity and unexpected help, had woven itself into the fabric of her thoughts. When her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, a simple text, "Hiking? There's a great trail near the old mill. Alex." A smile bloomed on her face before she could stop it. Her internal cynic warred briefly with a burgeoning curiosity, but curiosity for once won. She replied with a succinct, "Lead the way." The trail Alex had chosen was breathtaking. It wound through dense forests of oak and maple, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, still recovering from the recent deluge. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, creating a shifting mosaic on the forest floor. Alex, despite his previous awkwardness, moved with an easy grace that surprised her. He seemed to know the path intimately, pointing out hidden groves and explaining the local flora with a gentle enthusiasm. "You know," Tess commented as they navigated a particularly gnarled route, "you said you just moved here, but you seem to know these woods better than I do, and I've lived here my whole life." Her tone was light, but her curiosity was sharp. Alex paused, his gaze fixed on a distant patch of sunlight. I did some research before I came, wanted to make sure it was the right fit, and I've always been drawn to nature. It's a good antidote to everything else." He didn't elaborate, and Tess, sensing a boundary, didn't push. The vagueness was still there, a whisper of a secret, but today, surrounded by the vibrant life of the forest, it felt less like a threat and more like an intriguing puzzle. They talked as they walked, the conversation flowing with an ease that startled Tess. She found herself opening up, a rarity for her. She spoke of her dreams for the rusty anchor, expanding, maybe even adding a small kitchen, creating a true community hub. She spoke of the quiet satisfaction of building something with her own hands, of the lessons learned from past failures that had made her fiercely independent. "I just want to build something real," she confessed, her voice softer than usual. "Something that's truly mine, that no one can take away." Alex listened with an intensity that made her feel truly seen. He didn't interrupt or offer platitudes. When she finished, he simply nodded. "I understand that," he said, his voice low. "That need to create, to build something lasting, to have a space that's truly yours." He spoke vaguely of his own past, of pressures and expectations that had driven him to seek this quiet corner of the world. "Sometimes," he mused, kicking at a loose stone, "the biggest victories are the ones you fight for in silence, the ones that just make you feel free." He didn't say what he was fighting for, or from whom, but the conviction in his voice was palpable. He spoke of the suffocating weight of public life, though he never elaborated on what public life meant for him, and the desperate yearning for simplicity. They eventually reached the waterfall, a shimmering curtain of white noise cascading over moss-covered rocks into a clear, emerald pool. The rush of the waterfall filled the air, a powerful, primal sound that somehow amplified the growing connection between them. A slippery patch of moss covered the path leading to a small hidden alcove behind the falls. Alex, with a gentle hand at her back, guided her. "Careful," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. Their hands brushed again as he helped her steady herself on a wet rock, and this time the touch lingered, a soft electric current passing between them. Tess felt a flush rise on her cheeks, a tremor in her hand, and the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The thundering water and the almost unbearable awareness of his presence. After the hike, still buzzing with a strange energy, Alex suggested a detour to a small independent bookstore they'd passed on the way into town. "I saw a first edition of a collection I've been hunting," he admitted, a boyish excitement lighting his eyes. The bookstore was a treasure trove, smelling of old paper and dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Tess, a quiet lover of words, found herself drawn to the poetry section, while Alex gravitated towards obscure philosophy and forgotten classics. "You know," Tess called out from between towering shelves, "sometimes the quietest places have the loudest stories." Alex looked up from a leather-bound tome, a playful glint in his blue eyes. And sometimes the loudest people are hiding the quietest lives, he retorted, a pointed look in her direction that made her heart skip a beat. It was a subtle acknowledgement of their unspoken game, of the secrets that still existed between them. She caught her breath, a sudden vulnerability flaring. He eventually found his coveted book, a rare, delicate copy of a forgotten philosopher's musings on solitude. He held it with reverence, the almost crackle of turning book pages a soft sound in the quiet store. Tess, drawn by his quiet delight, leaned in to see. "What's so special about this one?" she asked, her voice soft. "It's about finding peace in anonymity," he explained, his gaze distant. "About the freedom that comes from shedding expectations." He bought it, then, surprisingly, bought a slim volume of poetry for her, a collection by a lesser-known female poet whose work explored themes of resilience and quiet strength. "Thought of you," he said simply, handing it to her, his fingers brushing hers again. The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly attuned to a part of her she rarely showed, that it almost brought tears to her eyes. They left the bookstore, the crisp scent of pine still clinging to their clothes from the hike, now mixed with the comforting smell of old books. Alex walked her back to the rusty anchor, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. The lingering vagueness about his past still existed, a quiet hum beneath the surface of their blossoming connection. But today, the feeling of tentative trust had blossomed, pushing back against Tess's ingrained cynicism. The easy laughter they shared, the moments of shared understanding, the sheer magnetic pull of his presence. It all felt undeniably real. As she stepped inside her bar, the warmth of the sun still on her skin, Tess realised that for the first time in a very long time, her guard felt less like a fortress and more like a gentle breeze, easily swept aside by the man with the quiet charm and the mysterious past. She knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that she was falling. And the thought, rather than sending her running, made her heart beat a little faster, filled with a nascent, exhilarating hope. The idyllic bubble Tess and Alex had created, a quiet world woven from shared hikes and whispered confidences, began to show its first hairline cracks. The spring air, once sweet with the promise of new beginnings, now carried a subtle chill, a premonition of change. The rusty anchor, usually a haven, started to feel like a stage, and Tess, suddenly, felt like an actor in a play she hadn't rehearsed. It started subtly, with a new face at the coffee shop across town, a woman with unnervingly sharp eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. Tess first noticed her on a Tuesday morning, nursing a lukewarm latte, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. The woman was well dressed, with a manicured efficiency that felt out of place in sleepy Juniper Creek. Her name, Tess overheard the barista say, was Veronica Vance, and she was a freelance journalist. The word sent a prickle of unease down Tess's spine. Juniper Creek didn't exactly have a thriving journalism scene. Then came the questions, not direct at first, but insidious, like tendrils of smoke. Veronica Vance would frequent the rusty anchor, nursing a seltzer, seemingly engrossed in her phone, but her gaze would often stray to Alex whenever he was there. She'd engage the regulars in seemingly innocent conversation, her questions peppered with casual inquiries about newcomers and people shaking things up in town. Tess, usually adept at ignoring small-town gossip, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She heard Veronica ask old Mr. Henderson about that mysterious new millionaire who bought the Willow Lane place, and the old man, oblivious, simply grumbled about city folk driving up property taxes. Tess watched Alex during these days, her protectiveness flaring. He was visibly uncomfortable. His easy laughter became strained, his conversations with her more guarded. He'd check his phone constantly, a subtle tremor in his fingers, his eyes darting to the door whenever it opened. He'd excuse himself more often, taking hushed calls outside, his voice low and urgent. The man who had sought refuge from noise was suddenly engulfed by an invisible humming static. One evening, after Veronica Vance had left the bar, leaving behind a lingering scent of expensive perfume and an uncomfortable silence, Tess approached Alex. He was at their usual spot at the corner of the bar, idly tracing patterns on the condensation of his glass. The nervous tapping of Alex's fingers against the cool glass was a small, insistent rhythm in the quiet bar. "Everything okay, Alex?" Tess asked, her voice soft but direct. He flinched as if pulled from a deep thought. "Fine, Tess. Why wouldn't it be?" His tone was clipped, defensive, a stark contrast to the open vulnerability he'd shown her on the hiking trail. "That woman," Tess pressed, lowering her voice. "Veronica Vance. She's been asking questions. About you. About newcomers to town." Alex's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening. "It's nothing. Just a nosy reporter looking for a puff piece. It happens." He tried to dismiss it with a shrug, but the tension in his shoulders belied his casual demeanour. "A puff piece?" Tess scoffed, her annoyance growing. "She looks like she's hunting for a Pulitzer. She's got that hungry look in her eyes." She wanted him to confide in her, to tell her what was really going on, to let her in. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken fears and suspicions. "Alex," she said, her voice laced with concern, "you've been jumpy. You're constantly on your phone. What's going on?" He finally met her gaze, and for a moment she saw a flash of raw fear in his eyes before it was quickly masked. "Tess, please, it's complicated. I'm handling it." He stood abruptly, pushing a stool back with a scrape that grated on Tess's nerves. "I should go. I have a call to make." He offered a tight, forced smile before retreating, leaving Tess with a bitter taste in her mouth, not unlike the bitter taste of the coffee she'd had earlier that morning while watching Veronica Vance. The next day, the unease escalated into a palpable threat. Tess was stocking shelves when Veronica Vance entered the Rusty Anchor, not bothering with her usual pretense of casual browse. She walked directly to the bar, her high heels clicking loudly on the wooden floor, a predatory glint in her eyes. The distant flash of a camera from outside, barely perceptible, made Tess's stomach clench. "Tess, isn't it?" Veronica purred, her voice overly sweet, too syrupy for the small-town bar. "I was hoping we could chat. About Alex." Tess's hand tightened on the bottle of whiskey she was holding. "Alex is a customer. That's all I know." She kept her voice flat, emotionless. Veronica laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "Oh, I think you know a little more than that. He's quite the story, our Alex. A real rags to riches, or should I say, riches to rancher, tale." She leaned conspiratorially across the bar. "Did you know he's not just a newcomer? He's the Alex Thorne, CEO of Thorne Innovations, billionaire tech mogul, been laying low for months ever since that little incident with the stock market manipulation allegations." The words hit Tess like a physical blow. Billionaire, CEO, Thorne Innovations, stock market manipulation, the pieces, the vague answers, the guardedness, the constant phone checks, they all slammed into place with a sickening thud. The world tilted on its axis. Her cynicism, once a shield, now felt like a cruel joke. Every shared laugh, every intimate moment, every touch. Was it all built on a lie? The truth, raw and ugly, left her breathless. Veronica Vance, oblivious to the emotional devastation she'd wrought, continued, her voice buzzing with anticipation. "Yeah, big story, and I'm the one who's breaking it. I just need a little local colour. How's he been settling in? Any unusual habits? Any local girlfriends?" Her eyes twinkled with malice. "I hear he's quite the charmer. Might make for a very interesting angle." Billionaire on the Lamb Fine small-town love affair. Tess felt cold, a deep, chilling cold that permeated her bones despite the warmth of the bar. Her gaze flickered to her phone on the counter, which seemed to be constantly vibrating with unseen notifications from the outside world. It was a stark symbol of the reality Alex had been hiding, a world far removed from the quiet comfort of Juniper Creek. She forced a smile, a shaky, unconvincing facade. "I wouldn't know anything about that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's just Alex." But the words felt like a lie, not to Veronica, but to herself. The trust she had tentatively offered, the hope she'd allowed to bloom, was now poisoned by the bitter taste of betrayal. The game was up, and Tess, with a heavy heart, knew that Alex's secret and their fragile connection were about to shatter. The digital world, a distant abstract concept in the tranquil embrace of Juniper Creek, exploded into Tess's life like a supernova. It started subtly, a ripple that turned into a tidal wave. News notifications pinged relentlessly on her phone, then the bar's old desktop computer, which usually only displayed local weather, suddenly flickered with blaring headlines from major news outlets. Tech billionaire Alex Thorne unmasked in remote upstate town. Thorne Innovations CEO hiding from scandal in secluded village. From boardroom to barstool, the secret life of a tech titan. Each headline, each grainy photo of Alex Thorne, staring out from a corporate portrait felt like a physical blow. The face was the same, those startling blue eyes, the slight crooked smile. But the context, the identity, was utterly alien. Tess's stomach churned, a sickening mix of shock, betrayal, and a crushing humiliation. She felt foolish, naive, her carefully constructed cynicism crumbling around her. How could she have been so blind, so willingly led into a lie? He walked in an hour later, looking less like a billionaire CEO and more like a man facing a firing squad. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale, and his usually clear eyes were clouded with a torment she instinctively recognized as fear. The moment he stepped through the door, the air in the rusty anchor crackled with an unspoken accusation. "Tess," he began, his voice hoarse, raw with unspoken agony. I can explain." Tess cut him off, her voice a sharp, unfamiliar blade. "Explain? Explain what, Alex? That everything you told me was a lie? That you're not just some guy who wanted a change of pace, but a runaway billionaire embroiled in scandal?" Her voice rose, laced with a bitterness that surprised even herself. "You stood right here, Alex, and talked about escaping noise, about wanting simplicity, all while you were running from a federal investigation." The accusation hung heavy in the air, echoing in the sudden silence of the bar. He took a step towards her, his hands outstretched in a plea. "No, Tess, it wasn't like that. Not all of it. I came here to escape, yes, but not just the media, the pressure, the expectations, the lies that became my life in that world. I wanted to find something real. And then I found you." His voice cracked, filled with a desperate honesty that almost broke through her anger. "You found me?" Tess scoffed, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. "You found me and decided I was gullible enough to fall for your little sabbatical act. Did you think this was some kind of game, Alex? Small-town bartender falls for mysterious stranger, only to discover he's a secret billionaire. Is that the story you wanted?" Tears stung her eyes, hot and sudden, blurring his distraught face. "My trust, Alex. You shattered it. Every shared laugh, every quiet moment, every time our hands brushed. Was it all just part of your elaborate escape plan?" "No!" he cried, his voice desperate, finally losing the guarded composure he'd clung to. "God, no, Tess. The connection, it was real. For me, it was the realest thing I'd felt in years. I never meant to hurt you. I was just so afraid." Afraid that if you knew who I really was, you'd never look at me, never give me a chance, that you'd only see the money, the headlines, the lies they tell about me. He gestured wildly towards the flickering screen of the bar computer. That's not who I am, Tess. Not the whole me. I'm not some stock market manipulator. Those were false allegations, a corporate smear campaign. I needed to disappear to clear my name, to fight it from the shadows. But I never meant for you to be caught in it. Tess felt a pang of something akin to pity, seeing the raw agony in his eyes. He looked utterly broken, stripped bare of all his carefully constructed defences. But the wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. I don't know what to believe anymore, Alex, she whispered, her voice trembling. How can I trust a single word you say when you built our entire relationship on a foundation of secrecy? Because I love you, Tess. The words burst from him, raw and unbidden, filling the stunned silence of the bar. I fell in love with you, the real you, and I was terrified of losing that, of losing you, if the truth came out. I tried to protect what we had, but I did it the wrong way, the cowardly way. His confession, so sudden and heartfelt, rocked her. She saw the genuine pain in his eyes, the undeniable truth in his words. But her own pain, the sting of betrayal, was still too sharp. Love? She repeated, the words sounding hollow. How can you love someone you lied to? How can you build anything real on a foundation of this? She gestured around the now empty bar where the news headlines continued to blare silently. Alex took another step forward, reaching for her, his hand trembling. Give me a chance, Tess. Let me prove it to you. Let me explain everything, without the lies, without the fear. But Tess recoiled, shaking her head. The enormity of it, the scale of his deception was overwhelming. I can't, Alex, not right now. I need you to leave. Her voice was barely audible, thick with unshed tears. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the man she was falling for, but the billionaire, the man from the headlines, the one who had kept a vast, sprawling secret from her. The two images blurred, then separated, leaving her utterly lost. His face crumbled. He stood there for a long moment, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of Tess's own heart. The silence after a slammed door echoed in the bar as he turned and walked out, leaving Tess standing alone amidst the cold, stark reality of the news headlines, the bitter taste of betrayal in her mouth. She sank onto a bar stool, the weight of his departure pressing down on her. The cold sting of tears finally broke free, tracing paths down her cheeks, mingling with the last remnants of her shattered trust. The bar, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison of her own making, reflecting back the fading light of a sunset, leaving her alone with her pain, the phantom touch of his hand still on her skin, a cruel reminder of what she had thought they had. How could I have been so blind, she thought, the question a desolate whisper in the empty room. He was a phantom, and I gave him my heart. Days blurred into a haze of quiet sorrow for Tess. The rusty anchor became her sanctuary once more, though its walls now held echoes of Alex, ghosts of laughter and whispered promises. The news cycle, in its relentless churn, moved on, but the image of Alex Thorne, the billionaire, lingered in her mind, a stark counterpoint to the Alex she'd known, the man who helped her stack chairs and talked of quiet places. She found herself replaying every moment, every conversation, searching for clues, for the cracks in his facade she had missed. And slowly, agonizingly, she began to see them, not as deceptive maneuvers, but as a man's desperate attempts to cling to a fragile normalcy. She remembered the flicker of fear in his eyes, the forced nonchalance when she'd questioned his past, the genuine joy in his voice when he spoke of simplicity. He hadn't just been hiding from scandal. He had been hiding from a life that had clearly suffocated him. One quiet night, as the hum of the empty bar's refrigerator was the only sound, Tess poured herself a glass of water, her fingers tracing the rim of the glass. She thought of Alex's confession of love, raw and desperate. A part of her had dismissed it as a desperate plea, but another, deeper part recognised its truth. He hadn't just said it, he had felt it. And the painful truth was, she had felt it too. Her cynicism, once a protective armour, had become a wall, blocking out not just pain, but also the possibility of a love that defied all her expectations. She remembered him helping her clean up, his hands brushing hers, the shared laughter in the bookstore. Those moments, she realised, weren't lies. They were real, profoundly real, and they had nothing to do with his wealth or his hidden identity. Then a new message popped up on her phone, not a news alert, but a simple text from an unknown number. It was long, clearly written over time, sent not in a moment of panic, but of reflection. It was from Alex. "Tess," the message began, "I know you probably hate me. You have every right. But I need you to know the whole truth, not just the headlines. Those allegations, they were a fabricated smear, part of a hostile takeover attempt by a rival company. I fled to Juniper Creek not just to escape the media circus, but to gather evidence, to fight this from a place where I could think, where I could breathe. I spent months holed up, unravelling a complex web of deceit, and then I met you. I found something real with you, Tess, something I hadn't known existed, a quiet, honest connection that made all the noise disappear. I was terrified to tell you the truth because I thought you'd only see the billionaire, the scandal, and not the man who was falling apart, who was desperate for something genuine. I was afraid of losing the only normal I'd ever known. I was a coward, and I destroyed the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me. I'm leaving tomorrow, headed to Zurich for the final legal battles. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know. Every moment with you was real, every feeling. I just pray one day you might believe that." Tess read the message twice, then a third time, her heart aching with a mixture of regret and a burgeoning hope. The knot of anger that had tightened in her chest began to loosen. His explanation wasn't an excuse, it was a confession of his deepest fear, the very vulnerability she'd been too hurt to see. He hadn't used her, he had hidden from her, for fear of losing her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been so afraid of being hurt that she had pushed away the very thing that offered true healing. She looked at the clock. It was late. His flight to Zurich would be early. Her instincts, usually so guarded, suddenly screamed for action. What am I waiting for, she thought. Love isn't about perfect beginnings. It's about courageous endings and new starts. She grabbed her keys, a sudden surge of adrenaline propelling her forward. The airport was a blur of noise and hurried goodbyes, a stark contrast to the quiet intimacy of Juniper Creek. The distant roar of airplane engines filled the vast terminal, a symphony of departures. Tess frantically scanned the crowded gates, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't know which gate, which flight. Just a desperate hope fueled her search. And then she saw him. He was standing near a gate, his back to her, a single carry-on bag at his feet. He looked tired, vulnerable, utterly alone amidst the bustling crowd. Just Alex. Not the billionaire from the headlines, but the quiet, awkward man who had walked into her bar and stolen her cynical heart. Alex! Her voice was a desperate cry, barely audible above the airport din, but he spun around, his head snapping up. His eyes, those astonishing blue eyes, widened in disbelief. He moved towards her, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, until he was standing directly in front of her. the world outside them fading into a blurry background. "Tess," he breathed, his voice raw with emotion. "You came." "You were leaving," she whispered, tears blurring her vision, but this time they were tears of relief, of hope. "You were going to just leave." I thought I had to," he confessed, his hand trembling as he reached for her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. "I thought I'd lost you, that I deserved to lose you." She leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his. "You were afraid," she said, understanding finally dawning fully. "You were so scared." He nodded, a single tear escaping the corner of his eye. "More than you know. Losing the money, the company. That was nothing compared to the thought of losing you. I found something real with you, Tess, and I ruined it because I was afraid of losing the only normal I'd ever known." She reached up, cupping his face in her hands, her gaze steady. "No more hiding, Alex, just us." She saw the question, the plea, the unwavering love in his eyes. "No more secrets, just real." He pulled her into a tight embrace, burying his face in her hair. The weight of Alex's hand on her back felt solid, real, grounding. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing past it, for seeing me." They stood there for a long moment, amidst the chaos of the airport, two souls finally finding their anchor in each other. His flight was boarding, the final call echoing over the loudspeakers. He pulled back, a hesitant question in his eyes. Tess smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Zurich sounds complicated, but I guess if you're there, I should probably be there too." A look of pure, unadulterated joy transformed his face. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," she said, squeezing his hand. "We face it together, all of it. The good, the bad, and the utterly ridiculous." He laughed, a sound of profound relief and happiness, and Tess felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. In the quiet hum of their joined hands, Tess knew home wasn't a place, but the courage to stand beside someone truly seen, truly loved, with no more shadows between them. It wasn't an ending, but a beautiful, terrifying, and utterly real beginning. And as they walked hand in hand towards the gate, ready to face whatever lay ahead, a shared knowing smile passed between them, a silent promise whispered between two hearts, finally brave enough to be truly open. Whispers in the Wisteria. The silence of Blackwood Manor was a physical presence. It was in the motes of dust dancing in the thin, watery light that sliced through the tall library windows. It was in the oppressive weight of the damask curtains, thick as shrouds, and it was in the hollow metronomic heartbeat of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting out seconds that felt like penance. Lord Alistair Beaumont, a man carved from the same winter frost that clung to the estate's ancient stones, stood with his back to the room, his gaze fixed on the world outside. He wasn't looking at the sprawling, dormant gardens, but at the skeletal fingers of a wisteria vine, a tangled grey artery clinging to the cold brickwork. It had not bloomed in 2 years, neither had he. He heard the soft click of the door and a rustle of skirts, but didn't turn. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb what little warmth there was in the room. "Lord Beaumont," a clear, steady voice replied. He finally turned, his inspection of her as brief and clinical as if he were buying livestock. He saw a woman of perhaps 25, plainly dressed in a travelling gown of deep blue wool. Her face was not conventionally beautiful, but it was intelligent, framed by chestnut hair pinned in a simple, practical knot. What held his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than intended were her eyes, the colour of moss after a rain, and in their depths, a quiet, unnerving perceptiveness. "Your references are impeccable," he began, moving to the great mahogany desk that served as a barricade between him and the world. He did not invite her to sit. "Your tutelage under Professor Albright at Cambridge is noted. Your fluency in French and Latin is sufficient." Each word was a carefully placed stone building a wall. He needed competence. He needed discipline. He did not need warmth, for warmth was a luxury this house could no longer afford. It was a kindness, he told himself, to keep the world at a distance. Eleanor Vance stood her ground, her hands clasped loosely before her. She absorbed his coldness not as an affront, but as a symptom. She'd seen grief before, but this was different. This was a structured architectural grief, a fortress built stone by painstaking stone. She noted the fine layer of dust on the spines of the leather-bound books, the faint scent of wood smoke and old paper mingling with something colder, something like neglect. "And your experience with difficult children?" Alistair's gaze flickered towards the door, a barely perceptible crack in his composure. "I have found, my lord, that there are no difficult children," Eleanor answered, her tone gentle but firm. "Only children who are navigating difficult circumstances. Their silence is not always a sign of defiance. Sometimes it is a language of its own. I am a patient listener." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to the very silence he had cultivated. He felt an unwelcome prickle of something, annoyance perhaps, or something dangerously close to hope. He gestured curtly to the door, and on cue it opened. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of grim sympathy, led a small girl into the room. This was Rosamond, 7 years old, with her father's dark hair and a face as pale and delicate as porcelain. In her hand she clutched a worn silver locket, her thumb stroking its smooth surface in a continuous, anxious rhythm. Her eyes, wide and dark, were fixed on the floor. She did not look at her father, and she did not look at the stranger. "Rosamond," Alistair said, his voice straining for a softness that was no longer natural to it. "This is Miss Vance. She has come to be your governess." Silence. The clock in the hall seemed to grow louder. Eleanor took a step forward and then knelt, bringing herself to the child's level. It was a simple gesture, but in the rigid formality of the house, it felt radical. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Rosamond," she said softly, her voice pitched for the girl alone. She didn't try to touch her. She didn't ask for a response. She simply waited. Rosamond's fingers tightened on the locket. Her gaze remained on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug. Alistair felt a muscle jump in his jaw. This was the moment all the other candidates had failed. They had pushed, they had cooed, they had produced sweets from their pockets, their brightly feigned cheerfulness and obscenity in the face of the child's mute sorrow. Eleanor simply rose, her moss-green eyes meeting Alistair's over the top of his daughter's head. "The wisteria on the outer wall is magnificent," she said, her voice returning to a conversational tone. "It must be a breathtaking sight in the spring." Alistair was caught off guard. He glanced at the window, at the tangled, lifeless vine. "It hasn't bloomed," he said, the admission costing him more than he would ever let on. "Perhaps it's only sleeping," Eleanor replied. "Some things just need a little patience, a little encouragement to remember the sun." He looked from her steady, unassuming face to the small, unmoving form of his daughter, and for the first time in 2 years, the silence of Blackwood Manor felt not like a comfort, but like a cage. He looked at this woman, this stranger who spoke of sun and sleeping things, and felt the first, terrifying tremor of a lock beginning to turn. "The position is yours, Miss Vance," he said, the words clipped. "Your duties begin on the morrow. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms." He turned back to the window, a dismissal. He could not afford to watch her go. He could not afford to see the hope in her eyes, because it would only illuminate the darkness in his own. The first few weeks passed in a succession of grey, damp days that bled one into the next. Eleanor moved through the sombre halls of Blackwood Manor like a quiet tide, a gentle, persistent force against the immovable rock of its grief. She established a routine in the schoolroom, a pocket of the house that had been shuttered and silent for 2 years. She aired it out, polished the wood, and filled a vase with holly from the garden, its bright red berries a small rebellion against the monochrome world outside. Rosamond remained a ghost, a silent shadow at her side. She would perform her lessons, mathematics, penmanship, geography, with a mechanical precision that was more heartbreaking than any tantrum. She still clutched the silver locket, her shield against the world. Yet, Eleanor persisted. She did not push for speech. Instead, she introduced a new language. She began to leave small, delicate watercolours on Rosamond's pillow each night. A robin with its impossibly bright breast, a shy snowdrop pushing through the frozen earth, a silvery moon. They were questions asked without words. One morning, Eleanor entered the schoolroom to find a single, slightly crushed primrose lying on her blotter. Its pale yellow face was a sun in miniature. Her heart gave a flutter, a hopeful, painful thing. She pressed the flower between the pages of her favourite book of poetry. That afternoon, while reading aloud, she noticed Rosamond watching her, her dark eyes lingering on the book, a silent acknowledgement. The true turning point came in the forgotten greenhouse at the edge of the kitchen garden. It was a skeletal structure of glass and rusted iron, its panes clouded with grime. Inside, a few gnarled, neglected rose bushes fought for life, their thorny branches like twisted claws. Eleanor saw a challenge. Armed with shears and a trowel, she set to work, clearing away the dead wood, turning the soil. She felt a presence, and looked up to see Rosamond standing in the doorway, a small, still figure half hidden by the frame. She didn't speak, but she watched. Every day she watched. Alistair too found himself watching. He took to walking down the West Wing corridor, a route he had long avoided just to pass the schoolroom. He would pause, hidden from sight, and listen. He heard the faint sound of Eleanor's voice, a soft melodic hum as she read from the Water Babies or recited French verbs. It was a sound of life, of normalcy, that was so alien it felt like a dream. He told himself it was for Rosamond's sake, but a deeper, more honest part of him knew he was starving, and her voice was a kind of nourishment. One rainy afternoon, with the sound of a steady drumbeat on the greenhouse glass, he finally breached the unspoken boundary. He entered the schoolroom under the thin pretense of inspecting the ceiling for a leak. Eleanor was at the desk, cleaning her paintbrushes, while Rosamond sat by the window, tracing the path of a raindrop down the pane. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice startlingly loud in the quiet room. She looked up, a smudge of viridian green on her cheek. "My lord, the ceiling seems to be holding strong." A faint smile played on her lips, and he realised with a jolt that he had never seen her smile before. It changed her face entirely, softening the intelligent severity into something warm and luminous. His eyes fell on the book of poetry lying open on her desk, the fragile pressed primrose marking a page. He recognised the binding. "Keats," he said, his voice softening involuntarily. "Yes, a particular favourite." He stepped closer, drawn in despite himself. He looked at the open page. "My late wife. She loved that passage." The words came out before he could stop them, a crack in the dam. "She used to say it was like finding a piece of sunshine in the dark. She would have liked your paintings." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife by name in Eleanor's presence. It was a shard of his past offered up sharp and glittering. Eleanor's gaze was full of an empathy so profound it asked for nothing in return. "I'm sure she was a woman of exceptional taste," she said softly. He looked at her. truly looked at her, not as an employee, but as a woman with a smudge of paint on her cheek and an ocean of understanding in her eyes. The air in the room shifted. The rain on the glass, the earthy smell of damp soil drifting from her work in the greenhouse, the quiet presence of his daughter, it all coalesced into a moment of startling clarity. He was not just an employer, and she was not just a governess. They were a man and a woman, standing together in a quiet room while the world outside began to thaw. Outside the window, unnoticed by either of them, the first timid green buds were beginning to push their way through the gnarled grey bark of the wisteria vine. Spring arrived not with a sudden burst, but as a slow, lyrical unfurling. It was in the shy blush of cherry blossoms along the drive, the insistent green of the lawns, and most of all, in the rose garden. Under Eleanor's patient hand, the space was transformed. What had been a tangle of thorns and sorrow was now a sanctuary of velvet petals and heady perfume. Roses the colour of cream, of sunset, of deep, bleeding crimson, climbed the old stone walls. It became Eleanor and Rosamond's haven, and in the safety of that garden surrounded by the scent of life, Rosamond began to speak. Not in sentences, but in whispers, single words offered up like precious gifts. Bird, blue, more. One afternoon, as Eleanor pruned a particularly beautiful blush-pink rose, Rosamond reached out a small hand and touched the petal. Pretty, she whispered, and the word was a miracle. Alistair watched them from his library window. He watched the woman in the simple dress and the little girl in the pinafore moving through the vibrant colours of the garden, and a feeling he could not name, a dangerous, beautiful ache bloomed in his chest. The house no longer felt like a tomb, it was breathing again. The evening the storm broke, the air was thick and warm, charged with an almost electric stillness. The sky bruised to a deep violet, and the first fat drops of rain struck the flagstones like a summons. Eleanor was hurrying Rosamond inside from the garden when the wind rose to a howl, slamming a shutter against the house with a deafening crack. Then, with a flicker and a groan, the lights went out, plunging the manor into a deep, velvety darkness. Mrs. Gable bustled about with candelabras, her movements brisk and efficient, but the sudden intimacy of candlelight changed everything. The grand, cavernous rooms became small, secret spaces, their corners filled with dancing shadows. After Rosamond was settled in bed, a lit candle by her side chasing away the worst of the darkness, Eleanor made her way downstairs. She found Alistair in the library standing before the hearth where a fire now roared, its flames painting his face in hues of orange and gold. He was no longer the cold, distant Baron. In the firelight he was just a man, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to bone deep. "The storm is quite fierce," Eleanor said, her voice a little breathless. "It is," he agreed, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Please, sit." She took a seat in the worn leather armchair opposite his. The storm raged outside, a wild symphony of wind and rain, but inside by the fire a profound quiet settled. And in that quiet they began to talk. Not about lessons or household matters, but about themselves. He spoke of his loneliness, the crushing weight of a title that felt like a suit of armour he could never remove. He confessed that Blackwood, his ancestral home, had felt more like a prison than a sanctuary for years. Then Eleanor shared her own quiet sorrows. She spoke of her parents, a country vicar and his wife, lost to fever when she was just a girl. She spoke of the precariousness of her independence, the constant humming fear of being utterly alone in a world that had little room for women of intelligence but no fortune. She laid her own vulnerability bare to match his. "This house," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked around the firelit room. "It doesn't feel so sad anymore." Alistair looked at her, the firelight catching in her moss-green eyes. "That is your doing, Miss Vance," he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "Eleanor, you have brought the spring inside." Her name on his lips was a caress. The air between them grew taut, humming with everything left unsaid. The storm outside, the crackling fire, the scent of rain-soaked roses and wisteria drifting through a slightly open window, it all faded into the background. There was only the space between them, a space that felt both immense and impossibly small. Later he walked her to the base of the grand staircase, the single candle he carried throwing their shadows, long and distorted, against the wall. The house was silent save for the drumming of the rain. He should have said good night. He should have turned and walked away. He did not. He stopped her, his hand gently closing around her arm. The touch was electric, a spark in the darkness that shot through her entire being. She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. His face was a mask of conflict, of longing and torment. He was the lord of the manor and she, the governess. The chasm between them was a thing of stone and centuries. But in that moment, it was nothing. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. She could feel the warmth of his breath, smell the faint scent of wood smoke on his clothes. Her eyes fluttered shut. It was happening. It was impossible, and it was happening. But then, with a shuddering breath, he pulled back. His hand dropped from her arm as if burned. The torment in his eyes was agonizing. "Forgive me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. I cannot." He turned and strode away, leaving her alone in the flickering darkness at the foot of the stairs, her heart hammering a silent, frantic rhythm against her ribs. The taste of a kiss she had not received burned on her lips, and the heartbeat-like silence he left behind was more devastating than the raging storm outside. High summer descended upon the countryside, heavy and gold. The wisteria at Blackwood was a marvel, a cascading waterfall of lavender blooms that scented the air with a perfume so sweet it was almost intoxicating. Alistair felt as if he'd been living in a black-and-white world, and Eleanor had, with painstaking care, coloured it in. He was lighter. He laughed, a sound so rusty and unfamiliar it startled the house staff. He spent afternoons in the garden, not watching from the window, but sitting with Eleanor and Rosamond, listening as his daughter now strung words together into shy, hopeful sentences. Feeling more alive than he had in years, he made a decision. It was bold, perhaps reckless, but it felt right. He would take them, both of them, to the annual summer fete at the neighbouring estate of Lord and Lady Ashworth. It was more than an outing, it was a statement. Eleanor was hesitant, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach, but seeing the quiet hope in Alistair's eyes and the sheer, unadulterated excitement in Rosamond's, she could not refuse. She wore a simple dress of pale green muslin, a loan from Mrs. Gable's long-disused trousseau, and with her hair done up with a few sprigs of baby's breath from the garden, she was not just the governess. She was radiant. For a few golden hours the world was perfect. Rosamond, holding tightly to both their hands, marvelled at the puppet show and begged for spun sugar. Alistair, for his part, moved through the throng of local gentry with a newfound ease, his eyes rarely leaving Eleanor. He saw her not against the sombre backdrop of Blackwood, but here, under the sun, and she was even more captivating. When the musician struck up a waltz, he turned to her, his expression stripped of all pretense. "Dance with me, Eleanor." It wasn't a question, it was a plea. She placed her hand in his and he led her to the grassy dance floor. As he swept her into the turn, the world fell away. There were no titles, no rules, no whispers. There was only the music, the warmth of his hand on her back, and the magnetic pull of his gaze. They were simply a man and a woman, lost in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. They had forgotten where they were, but the world had not forgotten them. Lady Danbury, A woman whose smile was as sharp and thin as a shard of glass had been watching. Her eyes, like a hawk's, had missed nothing. The lingering glances, the shared smiles, the easy intimacy. As the waltz ended and Alistair led a flushed and smiling Eleanor from the dance floor, Lady Danbury positioned herself in their path. "Such a remarkable recovery, Alistair," she said, her voice venomously sweet, yet pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Your dear Rosamond seems quite taken with her tutor." She let the word hang in the air, heavy with insinuation. One must be so careful about forming attachments in the home. They can be so inappropriate. The word struck Eleanor like a physical blow. The colour drained from her face. Suddenly the sun felt oppressive, the polite laughter and clinking glasses a deafening cacophony. She saw the other faces, the curious glances, the barely concealed smirks, the cold judgment. They were not seeing a man finding happiness. They were seeing a baron toying with his servant. A scandal in the making. Humiliation, cold and sharp, washed over her. She was a fool. She'd allowed herself to forget her place. She was an employee, a woman of no standing, and she had just publicly compromised the man she was beginning to love and the child she adored. "Excuse me," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, and before Alistair could react she turned and fled. She walked, almost ran, from the manicured lawns and the judging eyes, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. He found her hours later, in the library at Blackwood. She'd been packing. Her small trunk stood open, half filled with her meagre belongings. "What are you doing?" Alistair's voice was strained, a mixture of anger and confusion. "What I must," she replied, her back to him as she folded a dress with trembling hands. "I am leaving, my lord." "Because of that venomous old crow? Eleanor, you cannot let her words—" "It is not just her words," she cried, finally turning to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It is the truth in them. Look at us. I am the governess. You are the baron. They will not see a man and a woman. They will see a weakness, a disgrace. And Rosamond, I will not become a whisper that follows your daughter for the rest of her life. I will not be the reason they pity her." "I don't care what they see," he insisted, stepping towards her. "I care only for what I see." "And you cannot see the ruin this would bring," she countered, her voice breaking. "Your reputation, your standing. You have a duty to your name, to your daughter. My presence here as anything more than an employee jeopardizes that. I will not do it. I cannot." She was sacrificing her heart for their honour, and the nobility of it was a knife in his chest. He saw the trap closing around them, the cruel mechanics of the world they lived in. The beautiful, blooming wisteria on the wall outside no longer seemed a symbol of a life, but a heavy, suffocating weight, its beauty masking the way it slowly, inexorably choked the stone it clung to. He had brought her here to save his daughter, and now, to save his daughter, she was leaving him. A week passed, a week of crushing, unbearable silence. The life Eleanor had breathed into Blackwood Manor seeped away, leaving behind the familiar hollow echo of grief. The doors to the schoolroom were closed. The rose garden, though still in bloom, seemed to hold its breath, its colours muted. Eleanor remained, serving out a week's notice at Alistair's cold insistence, but she was a ghost, moving through the house with a quiet, heartbreaking efficiency. Each day was a slow, methodical erasure of her presence. The morning of her departure arrived with the first true bite of autumn in the air. The sky was a high, brilliant blue, and the leaves on the trees were just beginning to surrender to shades of gold and amber. Eleanor's packed trunk stood in the great hall by the door. The carriage was due any moment. Rosamond had retreated completely, the light in her eyes extinguished. She had not spoken a full sentence since the day of the fête, her small hand once again a permanent fixture on the silver locket she wore around her neck. Alistair found her in the library, She was not reading, simply standing by the window, looking out at the gardens. The warm golden light of the new season streamed in, illuminating the fine dust in the air. He felt a familiar despair creep back into his soul. He had failed. He had allowed the fear of whispers to shatter the most precious thing he had found. "Rosamond," he said softly. She turned to him, her small face etched with a sorrow far too deep for her years. Slowly she lifted the silver locket and with trembling fingers opened the clasp. Inside was a tiny, faded watercolour portrait of a smiling woman with kind eyes. Her mother. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. Rosamond looked from the portrait to her father, her dark eyes wide and pleading. And then she spoke, her voice clear and achingly steady in the silent room. "Will Eleanor be a memory now too?" The question struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. It was not an accusation, but a simple, devastating inquiry from a child who had already lost too much. In that moment, he saw his grief for what it had become, not an act of loyalty to the dead, but a cruelty to the living. He had been so determined to honour the memory of his wife that he was about to turn the one woman who had brought them back to life into a memory as well. He was forcing his own daughter to live in a gallery of ghosts. It was his choice. The whispers of society, or the clear, true voice of his daughter, the prison of his past, or the terrifying, hopeful expanse of a future. He didn't have to think. He strode from the library, his purpose afire in his veins. He found Eleanor standing by the open front door, her gloved hands clasped, her posture a study in dignified heartbreak, as she watched the carriage crunch up the gravel drive. "Don't go," he said. She turned, her expression guarded. "My lord, we have been over this. It is for the best." "No," he said, closing the distance between them until he stood directly before her. He reached out not to touch her, but as a gesture of supplication. "I have been a coward. I have been living my life by the rules of ghosts and gossips. Rosamond, she asked me if you were to become a memory. I will not let that happen." He took a deep breath, laying his heart bare. "I am not offering you a position, Eleanor. I am not asking you to stay as Rosamond's governess. I am asking you to stay as my partner, as my equal, as the woman I love." The words, once so terrifying, were now the simplest truth in the world. Let them whisper. Their words are wind in the leaves. You are the root, Eleanor. You are the bloom. Stay, and build a new garden with me. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, spilling over and tracing paths down her cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. She'd been so prepared to be strong, to sacrifice, that his raw, courageous sincerity undid her completely. She could only nod, a single, decisive movement. A tentative smile broke across Alistair's face, the first genuine, unburdened smile she'd ever seen. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Their hands fit together as if they were always meant to. Together they turned from the waiting carriage and the open door to the outside world. They walked back into the heart of the house, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished wooden floor. At the entrance to the library, Rosamond was waiting. She looked at their joined hands, and a small, hopeful smile touched her own lips. As they passed, she tentatively reached out her free hand, her small fingers finding and closing around Eleanor's. The three of them stood there for a moment in the warm autumn light, a man, a woman, and a child, a quiet, unspoken promise. And in the golden silence of the great house, they learned that the bravest love is not the one that shouts above the whispers of the world, but the one that builds a home strong enough to withstand them together.